If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Wait, YouTube, before you demonetize me, this is not a call to violence. I'm literally quoting a famous Buddhist monk, Lineage. The idea he's getting at is that when embarking on the path to awakening, people may find themselves drawn to charismatic teachers who have walked the path before them, hoping that these teachers will hold the key to enlightenment. We might become attached to certain teachings, believing that if we understand them intellectually, we'll finally get it. But when we progress, we realize that true wisdom doesn't come from outside ourselves. The capacity for awakening is within us, our very own Buddha nature. Master Linji would argue that clinging to external sources can obscure this truth, and so killing the Buddha means letting go of attachments, even attachments to our most dear teachings and teachers, our most dear conceptions and preconceptions. And when you think you finally got it, that's precisely when you should stop and engage in critical self-reflection. So in a sense, when we kill the Buddha, we become the Buddha ourselves, not in some grandiose or ego-driven way, but in a humble recognition of one's inherent capacity for awakenness. This is a fundamental teaching of Zen Buddhism. Now, Zen has made its way into our everyday vocabulary, but a lot of us don't really get what it means. It often evokes exotic and mystical stereotypes, the wise old sage living off in the mountains. Or we think of it as just meaning super chill, like I'm feeling so Zen right now. But what is Zen Buddhism really? At its core, Zen is a lineage within Mahayana Buddhism and a path of meditation, a way of directly experiencing the truth about oneself and the world around us that stretches back to the mind of the Buddha himself. Zen teaches to embrace one's true Buddha nature, and that a path to liberation can be found within each person, not in the heavens, not in temples, and not in sacred scriptures. According to legend, Zen traces its roots back to the Buddha and one of his most famous sermons, the Flower Sermon. Well, calling it a sermon might be a bit of a stretch. In Chinese it's called Nian Hua Wei Xiao, holding up a flower and smiling subtly. Guess what happens? Well, spoiler alert, the Buddha assembles his disciples, holds up a flower, and smiles subtly. The other disciples are confused? What's going on here? Only the great monk Mahakashyapa understands and smiles back, recognizing the profound meaning of this silent sermon. With this wordless exchange, the Buddha is said to have transmitted the essence of his teachings, the first to receive what's called Ishin Chuanshin, or mind-to-mind transmission. Thus, the Buddha planted the seed in the mind of the one who goes down in Zen tradition as the first Zen patriarch. Now, that's the legendary origin story. For the somewhat more historical origin story, let's fast forward to China in the 500 CE, when a lineage of Mahayana Buddhism started to emerge called Chan Buddhism. Chan went on to flourish across East Asia, becoming known as Son in Korea, Tin in Vietnam, and Zen in Japan. Technically, these all refer to the same lineage of practice, but Zen is the most popular word and thus is used most often in intro textbooks and intro YouTube video titles. The word Chan derives from the Sanskrit dhyana, sometimes simply translated as meditation, though it refers to deeper levels of meditative absorption, as well as some of the heavens in Buddhist cosmology. Like if you die in a dhyana state, you'll be reborn in one of those heavens, and as we'll see later, meditative practices are central to Zen. Tradition holds that Chan Buddhism was founded by a semi-legendary Indian monk named Bodhidharma. He purportedly showed up at the Shaolin Monastery sometime in the late 400s and early 500s CE. Yeah, I'm talking about that Shaolin Monastery, later made famous by Kung Fu. He brought along with him teachings that became the cornerstone of Zen Buddhism, which revolve around the direct realization of one's own Buddha nature through meditation. These teachings show up in a short text called the Treatise on the Two Entrances and Four Practices, traditionally attributed to Bodhidharma and dating to the late 500s CE. Now, scholars call this a proto-Chan text, meaning it doesn't have all of the features of fully developed Chan Buddhism, but the seeds are clearly there. It outlines two complementary pathways to awakening, which it calls entrances, the entrance of principle and the entrance of practice. The entrance of practice focuses on daily behavior and offers 4 steps. Accept all suffering as the fruition of past transgressions without complaint, acceptance of circumstances, to remain unmoved even by good fortune, be without craving, and practice in accordance with the Dharma to eradicate wrong thoughts without practicing. The entrance of principle, meanwhile, outlines the idea of Buddha nature. One must have a profound faith in the fact that one and the same true nature is possessed by all sentient beings, both ordinary and enlightened, and that this true nature is only covered up and made imperceptible by false sense impressions. The treatise's central claim that all beings possess an inherent potential to achieve Buddhahood became foundational for later Chan thought. The scholar John McRae writes that this text encapsulates the doctrinal nucleus of much, if not all, later Chan theory and ideology. Now, Buddha nature was an extremely important concept in all of Chinese Buddhism, known as Fuoxing. Chinese Buddhists developed the idea of Buddha-nature to explain how enlightenment is even possible if someone has accumulated a ton of bad karma over potentially countless lifetimes. Basically, according to the idea, everyone has an inherent potential for awakening, like a seed waiting to sprout. Buddhists actually likened it to a garba, or a womb or fetus waiting to develop. This potential exists alongside our karmic baggage, which are both stored in a storehouse consciousness, or alaya vijnana. So even though we make mistakes, the capacity for awakening remains intact. Karmic seeds that come to fruition. Zen texts often describe this using the metaphor of a mirror. The Chinese master Huineng writes, "The mind is the Bodhi tree. The body is the mirror stand. The mirror is originally clean and pure. Where can dust stain it?" In other words, our true nature is always present and unblemished, perfectly clear, reflecting everything without distortion or attachment, if only we can learn to see it. For Chan Buddhists, this idea was central, and they argued that it's not about getting enlightened, it's about demonstrating the enlightenment that's already within you. You don't have to go out and find your Buddha nature. You just have to stop being ignorant of it, distracted by false impressions, habits, and all that mental noise. So how do we dispel ignorance of our true Buddha nature? You might think, well, go read a book. Throw yourself into the study of the greatest Buddhist texts. Memorize the doctrines taught by the greatest Zen masters. Go get your PhD in Zen Buddhism. Then, only then, can you dispel your ignorance. But Zen complicates that idea. Here we turn to another key Zen teaching. Zen is a special transmission outside the scriptures, not relying on words and letters, pointing directly to the human mind, seeing into one's true nature, and becoming a Buddha. This is a saying attributed to Bodhidharma that became popular during the Song dynasty in China, and it basically means that realizing one's true Buddha nature does not rely on understanding established doctrines or texts. It involves direct personal insight, which ultimately leads to awakening as a Buddha. This insight cannot be fully conveyed by words or textual study, and must be experienced firsthand, typically through Zazen, or seated meditation, which we'll get into shortly. By de-emphasizing texts and doctrines, Zen Buddhism has often been described as a radical break from a more intellectual approach to Buddhism, an explicit rejection of the ultimate authority of writing. This has led to the misunderstanding that Zen is anti-intellectual, like it's all about rejecting books and tossing out study altogether, but that's not quite right. Zen absolutely includes the study of written texts. There are tons of Zen texts that you could spend several lifetimes studying. The point in Zen isn't that study, doctrine, or ritual are not important, it's that they can be understood more deeply. In fact, Zen monastics have long engaged in rigorous sutra study, highly ritualized monastic life, and Pure Land practices. Trying to understand Zen literature without a firm grasp of Mahayana sutras and philosophy is basically impossible. The key is how these texts are used. In Zen, they're seen as provisional tools, helpful pointers, which is common in many Mahayana traditions. A saying attributed to the Mahayana Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna says, "As the ignorant grasp the fingertip that points to the moon and do not see the moon, so those who cling to the letter do not see my truth." In other words, scriptures and doctrines are like fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself. The danger comes when we mistake the pointer for the destination. In fact, there's another saying attributed to Bodhidharma that if you rely only on reading to understand the Dharma, your chi, or your vital energy, will be weak. Zen is all about experiencing the truth firsthand, not just analyzing someone else's version of it. Even an extremely erudite text from a great Zen master is, at best, a second-hand account of someone else's direct experience. Reading about someone else's awakening is not the same as waking up yourself. The phrase "a special transmission outside the scriptures," not relying on words and letters, is more about arguing that words cannot fully capture reality. They can't help you solve the problem of rebirth or recognize your inherent Buddha nature. Zen masters like Dahui argued the point of words is to point to something beyond words, and he criticized those who over-intellectualize the path to awakening. Your whole life you've made up so many little word games. When the last day of your life arrives, which phrases are you going to use to oppose birth and death? We also saw this teaching in the Flower Sermon, with the Buddha's wordless transmission of his teachings. After this exchange, the Buddha declared, "I have the all-pervading true Dharma, incomparable nirvana, exquisite teaching of formless form. It does not rely on words and letters and is transmitted outside all doctrines. I now hand it to Mahakashyapa." In other words, liberating insight is conveyed directly from teacher to student, bypassing words and doctrines. In this we see another key feature of Zen, a strong emphasis on lineage. Instead of rooting its authority in sacred texts, Chan Buddhism bases its legitimacy on a direct personal connection between teacher and student. The direct transmission of insight from master to disciple creates an unbroken chain that extends back to the mind of the Buddha himself. That wordless exchange between the Buddha and Mahakashyapa is said to mark the start of the Chan lineage, and this special transmission became the defining feature of Chan's identity, with a lineage of patriarchs called Zushi serving as the custodians of that transmission. Now, Zushi is usually translated as patriarch, but it literally means ancestral teacher. The list of Chan patriarchs varies, but a common list includes 28 Indian patriarchs, starting with Mahakashyapa, and 6 Chinese patriarchs. Bodhidharma serves as both the 28th Indian patriarch and the first Chinese patriarch. Another key concept in Zen Buddhism is Dwunwu, often translated as sudden awakening. Sudden awakening signifies that enlightenment is not a gradual process, but a direct realization of one's inherent Buddha nature, which on the surface challenges the notion that enlightenment requires extensive learning or practice. The idea of Buddha nature suggests that enlightenment is an inner reality to be uncovered, not an external state to be achieved, and this can be realized in a single transformative moment. Take, for example, the story of Bodhidharma and the second Chinese patriarch Huike. According to legend, after showing up at the Shaolin Temple, Bodhidharma went off to a cave where he spent 9 years just meditating while staring at a wall. Meanwhile, Huike was so desperate to learn from him that he waited outside in the freezing snow. Bodhidharma ignored him, until, in an extreme show of dedication, Huike chopped off his own left arm and offered it to Bodhidharma to show how serious he was. Bodhidharma was like, "Okay, fine, you've got my attention now." Huike then says, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify it for me." Bodhidharma responds, "Bring me your mind, and I will." Huike says, "But no matter how I might look, the mind is not a thing I can find." Bodhidharma replied, "There, I've pacified your mind for you." Boom. Suddenly, Huike is awakened. This pivotal moment occurs not through gradual study, but in a single transformative exchange with Bodhidharma. Huike confesses his restless mind, but Bodhidharma's simple yet profound response, challenging him to find the mind as a tangible thing, shatters Huike's preconceived notions and leads him to an instantaneous realization of his Buddha nature. Another example is the story of the patriarch Huineng. According to legend, he was an illiterate peasant who attained awakening upon hearing a single verse of the Diamond Sutra, one of the most influential Mahayana sutras. One line and boom, he was awakened. So notice that the concept of sudden awakening means that awakening is democratized. It's within reach of all people, regardless of social status or education, though the concept was debated in the early centuries of Chan history. The traditional narrative is that there was a debate between a so-called Southern school, which taught sudden awakening, and a Northern school linked with gradual awakening, with the sudden awakening school eventually winning. Though the story isn't quite as straightforward as it sounds, the idea that there were two clearly distinct schools mostly comes from the writing of the Chan monk Shanhui, who promoted his own lineage by criticizing a rival lineage. This sharp contrast between sudden and gradual awakening was likely exaggerated for rhetorical effect. So while the sudden awakening model did become dominant in later tradition, the historical picture is much, much messier. Other Chan Buddhists developed a two-tier position, called Dwunwu Jianqiu, or sudden awakening followed by gradual cultivation. In this framework, you can suddenly experience something called understanding awakening, where the being suddenly realizes that they are a Buddha. But this realization alone is not sufficient to attain Buddhahood. After that initial awakening, you've got to put in the work. Gradual cultivation. Unlearning all of the bad habits and mental patterns you've built up over, well, eons. It's only through this long, steady process that you can actually live as a Buddha and fully embody awakening. The Zen master Zongmi uses the metaphor of a newborn infant. You've got all the potential of a full-grown adult, but you've got to grow up, learn, and mature before you can fully realize that potential. With this emphasis on Dwunwu, or sudden awakening, Chan masters developed distinctive teaching styles meant to spark insight in the moment. They use stories, questions, or statements called koans in Japanese, like that "kill the Buddha" statement we started with. Other famous ones include, "What is your original face before your father and mother were born?" Or "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" It's not meant to have a logical solution. These questions are designed to cut through conceptual or dualistic thinking and provoke sudden, direct realization into the nature of reality. During the Song Dynasty, this practice of working with koans evolved into a specific meditative method called Kanhwa-chan, or questioning meditation. One of the key figures behind this approach was the Chan master Dahui, who emphasized not just reading or studying koans, but sitting with them as an object of meditation, sometimes meditating on a single key word in the koan. Chan masters also developed, let's call them, more direct teaching methods to shake students out of their mental ruts. Masters like Linji and Mazu Dai were known for shock techniques called bangha, or the stick and the shout. This involved shouting, hitting, kicking, and using irrational retorts to startle their students into sudden awakening. This also included using Zen awakening sticks to hit students if they start losing their concentration. Yeah, maybe rethink the idea that Zen means super chill. These unconventional methods were designed to disrupt ordinary thinking, challenge their students' perceptions, and stop students from over-intellectualizing, prompting not just intellectual comprehension, but sudden awakening. But direct insight is usually cultivated through a consistent physical practice called Zazen, or seated meditation, which is the heart of Zen practice. So what does Zazen actually look like? Well, you don't need a monastery or a mountaintop, but a quiet, uncluttered space helps. Some people create a small meditation area with a cushion called a zafu and mats called zabutons to support an upright, stable posture. And posture is important. In Zen, the body and mind are seen as interconnected, so how one sits matters. Practitioners may sit cross-legged on a cushion, but also might kneel or use a chair. Again, whatever supports an upright, stable, and relaxed posture. Hands are typically placed in the lap and the eyes remain softly open, gazing downward. This posture encourages alertness without tension. Breath becomes the primary focus, with some traditions teaching breath counting, inhaling on 1, exhaling on 2, all the way up to 10 before beginning again. This is seen as a technique to anchor awareness. The goal is not to suppress thought, but to observe its movement and gently return attention to the breath whenever the mind wanders. In time, thoughts are treated like passing clouds, acknowledged but not pursued. As the Zen master Dogen writes, to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. The aim of Zazen is not self-improvement in the conventional sense, but a direct embodied realization of what has always been present. Alongside seated meditation, Zen practice also includes walking meditation known as kinhin. While Zazen emphasizes stillness, kinhin introduces mindfulness in motion, bringing the same attentiveness cultivated while sitting into each physical step. In kinhin, practitioners walk slowly and deliberately, often in a circular path, focusing attention on posture, movement, and breath. Though the practice appears simple, it can be deceptively difficult. Walking at a slow pace runs counter to the fast-paced rhythms of daily life. But walking meditation trains the mind to settle into the body in the present moment, where even the act of walking becomes a form of insight. As Dogen wrote, if you walk in the way of Buddhas and ancestors, then you are a Buddha or ancestor. So, to summarize, Zen is all about direct personal experience of your true nature, not relying on scriptures, doctrines, and intellectualizing. It's about realizing that you already have Buddha nature deep within you, and awakening is not about acquiring something new, it's about uncovering what's always been there. Usually through seated meditation, but also through other practices like walking meditation, meditating on those cryptic koans, or even getting smacked with an awakening stick. So how do we go from Chan to Zen? As in, how do we go from the Chinese context to the Japanese context? Over the centuries, Zen has deeply influenced Japanese culture, from the tea ceremony and landscape gardening to martial arts and haiku poetry. You can see Zen everywhere. By the middle of the 1100s, Chan was the dominant form of Buddhism in China, and a network of monasteries was even receiving state sponsorship from the Song dynasty. In this context, two major schools emerged: the Lineage school, which would later become known as Rinzai in Japanese, and the Caodong school, later known as Soto in Japanese. Lineage was known for its dynamic and sometimes confrontational style and emphasis on koans, while Caodong focused on silent illumination through the practice of just sitting, a form of meditation where the mere act of sitting is considered a manifestation of enlightenment. Lineages from these two schools eventually made their way to Japan in the 1100s and 1200s, thanks to the Japanese Buddhist monks Eisai and Dogen, who both journeyed from Japan to study in China's grand monasteries, bringing Chan Buddhism back to their homeland. Eisai was a Japanese Buddhist of the Tendai tradition, a Japanese branch of Mahayana Buddhism known for esotericism and tantric-style practice. In fact, Eisai was known as a tantric specialist himself. He traveled to China to study under a Lineage Chan master, and after receiving the special transmission from him, Eisai returned to Japan and went on to establish the Rinzai school of Zen Buddhism. The Rinzai school placed a strong emphasis on koan practice. In fact, in Rinzai, koans became part of a structured training system, with students working through a carefully sequenced curriculum of koans under the guidance of a teacher. And again, the goal of koans was not to solve them intellectually, but to trigger moments of deep, non-conceptual insight. One of the most famous koans in the Rinzai tradition is the so-called Mu koan. It comes from a dialogue between the Chan master Jiaozhou and a student who asks a seemingly straightforward question: does a dog have Buddha nature? Now, according to Mahayana Buddhist teachings, the answer is a clear, easy yes. All sentient beings are said to possess Buddha nature, but Jiaozhou doesn't say yes, he says mu, no, or literally, it does not have it. Wait a minute, is Jiaozhou denying a core doctrine? Well, no, not exactly. His answer is not meant to be a doctrinal correction. It's not even meant to make sense in a logical way. Instead, this kind of answer is meant to disrupt the student's expectations, to break the mind out of its usual habits and push the student into a state of deep questioning. This sense of confusion or even frustration becomes meditation fuel. In fact, the word mu became a central meditative focus in Rinzai Zen. Practitioners are instructed to sit with this koan, not to figure it out intellectually, but to experience it. Again, it's not about getting a logical answer. It's about pushing them toward kensho, a sudden insight or glimpse into their own Buddha nature. Eisai is also credited with introducing tea culture to Japan, which eventually blossomed into the ritualized Japanese tea ceremony. He even wrote a treatise called Drinking Tea for Health, promoting tea as a medicine for body and mind. The other major figure in introducing Zen to Japan was Dogen. Like Eisai, he started as a Tendai monk, and actually studied under one of Eisai's students. But Dogen wasn't satisfied with the answers he was getting in Japan, so he did what any serious seeker did back then and packed his bags and went to China, where he encountered the Caodong lineage of Chan Buddhism. He brought it back to Japan, where it became known as Soto. While Dogen did write extensively on koans, he explicitly discouraged focusing on them during Zazen. Instead, he emphasized what he called non-thinking. This idea comes from an 8th century Zen dialogue. A monk once asked Master Yaoshan, "What do you think about while meditating?" Yaoshan replied, "Think not thinking." The monk asked, "How do you think not thinking?" Yaoshan answered, "Non-thinking." It's cryptic, but that's the point. This is not ordinary thinking. The Chinese word used here for thinking, xi liang, carries connotations of calculation, evaluation, and even desiring. Dogen picked up on this and advised his students to put aside the intellectual practice of investigating words and chasing phrases, and learn to take the backward step that turns the light of the mind around and shines it inward. Give up the operations of the mind, intellect, and consciousness. Stop measuring with thoughts, ideas, and views. The modern Soto Zen monk Suzuki Roshi said the point is not to stop your thinking, but to let your thinking come and go like clouds in a vast sky without getting caught up in their stories. Let it stop by itself, he says. Things will come as they come and go as they go. Then eventually your clear, empty mind will last fairly long. So during Zazen, Soto Zen urges practitioners to abandon this way of thinking, where the mind is constantly evaluating everything as an object separate from itself. How do you do that? Well, Dogen's answer sounds almost too simple. Just sit. Shikantaza. Don't chase your thoughts. Don't try to shut them down. Just let them come and go without judgment or attachment. And over time, the constant stream of thoughts may quiet down, creating moments of profound stillness where the mind simply is, without the usual noise. In Soto Zen, especially in the practice of Shikantaza, enlightenment is not typically seen as a lightning bolt event. Instead, it's more like a slow, steady unfolding, what's called mokusho, or silent illumination of your Buddha nature. But for Dogen, just sitting was not a means to enlightenment, it was enlightenment, fully expressed in the present moment. You don't need to become a Buddha, you are a Buddha. When comparing Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen, the scholar Brett Davis uses the analogy of a slow simmer versus a pressure cooker. Soto Zen is the slow simmer, where realization gently unfolds through steady, silent practice. Rinzai Zen, on the other hand, uses koans and intense student-teacher exchanges to build up mental tension until it bursts into sudden awakening. As Japan opened its doors to the West in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pioneering teachers like Shaku Soen and D.T. Suzuki began to introduce Zen to American audiences. Japanese-American immigrants also founded Zen temples in Hawaii and California. The 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago marked a turning point. Shaku Soen's disciple Suzuki presented Zen as the essence of Asian spirituality, stripped of cultural trappings and religious dogma. And in the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of spiritual seekers discovered Zen through the writings of Alan Watts and the beat poets like Jack Kerouac. Japanese masters like Taizan Maizumi established thriving centers in California, and American-born teachers helped to translate Zen into a Western idiom. Today, Zen is a vibrant and diverse presence in American Buddhist life, with hundreds of centers and groups representing various lineages and styles of practice. So let's return again to that provocative saying that we started with. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. I hope its deeper meaning has become clear by now. This is not a call to violence, but a reminder that the truth we seek can't be found outside ourselves, in any external authority or conceptual formulation. The real killing that the Zen masters speak of is letting go of attachments and preconceptions, shedding all that obscures one's inherent Buddha nature. In a sense, that is a kind of death, but the death of the ego, the death of the illusion that people are separate and permanent. Even though Zen practice emphasizes finding the Buddha within, scholars and practitioners alike have noticed a tendency in individualistic societies like the US to interpret that inward search as a personal quest for spiritual authenticity, self-actualization, or self-improvement. The kind of Buddhism as self-discovery that we see in books like Kerouac's Dharma Bums. Though many Zen practitioners would argue that one needs to counterbalance this individualizing tendency through communal practice. As in, working in the temple kitchen, performing routine chores, or participating in the daily life of the community should not be seen as peripheral, but integral to the path. Embodied practices that challenge self-centeredness and reinforce the idea that awakening is not a solitary accomplishment. Sometimes killing the ego looks a lot like washing dishes at the local temple. So whether you're sitting in meditation or raking sand in the temple garden, Zen practice reminds people that awakening is not about acquiring something new. It's about unlearning the habits that obscure what's already there. And often it's in the most ordinary moments that those insights emerge. Thanks to today's sponsor, Incogni, a data removal service that acts on your behalf dealing with companies called data brokers. You can sign up using the link in the description below or use my code RFBIncogni for a 60% off discount. Data brokers are companies that collect and sell your online data without your consent. Everything from your email address and shopping habits to more sensitive stuff like your social security number, financial history, or even court records. And once your data is in their hands, it doesn't just sit there. It gets passed around, sold again, and repackaged. They're the reason why in the US you can search your name and find a bunch of websites that have your phone number or home address. It might also be why you're getting so many spam calls. Now, you do technically have the right to ask these companies to delete your information, but doing that yourself would take hundreds and hundreds of hours. That's where Incogni comes in. They contact literally hundreds of data brokers on your behalf, request that your personal information be deleted, and handle any pushback along the way. And they don't just do it once. They monitor and repeat the process throughout the year in case your data pops up again. And the best part is, it's all automated. You sign up, you grant them permission to act on your behalf, and then they do the rest. You get regular progress updates throughout the year, and they even have a family plan if you want to protect your loved ones too. So if you want to take back control of your data and avoid the nightmare of hunting it all down yourself, sign up for Incogni. You can use the link in the description below or use the code RFBIncogni to get an exclusive 60% off discount. Again, that's RFBIncogni. Thanks everyone.